Hi everyone, welcome back. This is our third week of virtual online instruction, so hopefully at this point we're sort of getting into a groove. Yesterday was exam 3, so I've sort of changed the syllabus a little bit. I haven't posted a new version, but I just sort of want to review where we're going in the next couple of weeks. So April 7th and 8th, so 4-7, 4-8, and then the following week, which ends up being, we don't have class on Monday, so these dates, I am going to devote to what we're going to call Chapter 13, although I'm going to put that in quotes and I'll explain that in a second. The following week, which would be 420 through 424, we are going to devote to Chapter 14. And then what ends up being week 15 of class for us, which is 427 through 5-1, we are going to call that Chapter 15. That sort of gives us nicely laid out modules of material where we're basically doing one chapter per week and not splitting one chapter over multiple weeks, with the exception of sort of this one that we're starting, and that's just because Easter break falls on Friday and Monday, so we lose 2 days, which I'm just going to sort of recoup next week. So we do get a little bit of extra time in Chapter 13, which is probably good because this is the chapter that focuses primarily on the brain and sort of what the brain is doing, which is incredibly dense material and very complex. So having sort of that extra day of content in there is probably going to be actually useful for us. As always, I'll let you know via email and on MO2 how the weeks are going to be laid out in terms of the number of sort of mini lectures, which I don't always know going into a chapter. And then for 5-point opportunities, you'll definitely have one today for April 7th, one tomorrow, and then all of these days. So for this chapter, you'll end up with 5 of those 5-point opportunities, as well as your review sheet to go along with those. So make sure you're working on those. I will send a little bit of information about the results from exam 3 when I get there. So I'm recording this before April 7th, so I don't actually know how the exam is going, but hopefully very well. Okay, so in these next 3 weeks, or next 3 chapters that we're going to be talking about, these are all nervous system chapters. So our book talks about them as anatomy of the nervous system for Chapter 13, somatic nervous system for Chapter 14, and then autonomic nervous system for Chapter 15. I am going to leave those designations as they are. Please pay careful attention to the to-do list on MO2 to see how in-depth and what sections of the chapters you should read. I said this when we started Chapter 12, but I don't love the depth of material, and I don't always love the organization of the nervous system in our textbook. So I do deviate from that in some places pretty substantially, and so I may not have you read all of a chapter, or I may have you focus more heavily on one part and sort of ignore other parts. So just pay attention to MO2 and to the emails that I'm sending to give us a little bit more clarity on what you should be focusing on. Okay, and so that's why I call these, on this slide I have Chapter 13-ish, and then I put our Chapter 13, 14, and 15 in air quotes there, or actual quotes, I guess, because I'm basing our lecture and the format of our class sort of loosely on these chapters at this point, but you'll notice that what I present can at times be quite a step further, or actually combine concepts that are in 2 completely different chapters, just because the order and organization makes more sense to me in this way. Okay, so I think that's all of the catch-up I have to do. I just wanted to give us a little bit of entry or lead into this material, because we're sticking with the nervous system for the rest of the class. We basically have 3 full weeks and then a couple of exams in here, and so we're really sort of approaching our make or break point here. Like I mentioned on the last slide, this chapter is going to be very dense. We are essentially looking at the study of the brain and the cranial nerves. We're going to spend just a touch of time on the cranial nerves, but more time identifying the regions of the brain and the purpose of the brain. The brain is just, again, so complex that these objectives on this slide are pretty intense compared to some of our other objectives because of the number of components that we have and how these components all interact with each other. So the first sort of set of objectives here are our anatomy, and then as we get down into these last couple of objectives, we're talking more about how the brain communicates with itself and with other body parts, and what exactly the function of our central nervous system is going to be. So let's sort of take our time getting into this chapter and see where we can end up. The first thing I sort of want to think about as we enter this chapter is what is really the clinical importance of the brain. We are pretty familiar with, what the clinical importance of the heart is. It keeps our blood moving. What the clinical importance of the stomach is, or the large intestine. The brain clinically is probably the most significant component of the body. We use brain and brain activity as a way to determine whether somebody is dead or alive. So neurological function or function of the central nervous system is essential to what we call life. If somebody's brain stem, so yeah, I guess I can do this. So this sort of region of the brain in here, which is going to regulate our visceral functions, so like our heartbeat and our blood pressure and our body temperature, if that's intact, but the cerebral cortex, which is this wrinkly surface of the brain, doesn't have any activity, we consider that person dead. So it is a fascinating organ from a clinical standpoint, as well as just from an anatomical and physiological standpoint. We do have a number of functions, and so we will come back to all of these in much greater detail, but our brain does control our motor functions, so that's the ability of our body to move. Sensation, so what we feel and understand, comes from the brain. Our emotions and our thoughts, right? These again are very, very complex topics. We are still learning a ton about how people behave, what that has to do with emotion, what that has to do with their ability to process and integrate and understand stimuli in the environment around them. Sort of on an evolutionary note, in evolution, when we think back to other organisms that also have central nervous systems composed of a spinal cord and a brain, and we compare a human spinal cord and brain with maybe a very distant relative, what we see is over evolutionary time, we have very little change in the spinal cord. So the spinal cord structure and function remains very consistent from species to species to species, but the brain has exhibited really large scale changes. We just tend to change the brain in humans. It is about 55 times the spinal cord by weight, so it weighs about 55 times as much. That's huge, and that's much different than we see in other species that actually have very small brains, and they don't have the ability to do some of these things that humans do, right? So our ability to I can't think of the word now. Anyways, our ability to understand and empathize, that was the word I was looking for, is very different and sort of very unique to our species. Before we get into a lot of the anatomy of the brain, we are going to use reference points or landmarks when we're discussing what different pieces of the brain, where they're located, and how they are situated in relation to other parts of the brain. So I have a couple of major landmarks listed on this slide that we're going to need to know. Remember, like I just said, we use these as reference points, so we're going to need to know where these are, because I may say such and such is posterior to the cerebellum, or inferior or anterior, or something in relation to the cerebellum. We need to know then where the cerebellum is. So the first are two directional terms, and these are the only, this is, as far as I can think of, the only organ that we use rostral and caudal with when we're talking about directions. Rostral is going to mean towards the nose. And caudal is going to mean towards the tail. Now, I realize that humans don't have tails, but we use these terms to talk about other species as well. If it helps you, you could think of caudal as being towards the spinal cord. And even though we do have a nose, the orientation of our nose to our brain is a little bit different than we see, so you could also think of this as being towards the forehead. So if something is rostral, it's going to be towards the forehead of the head, forehead of the face, forehead of the cranial cavity, which would be up here in this direction. If something is caudal, it's going to be moving back towards the vertebral column, so back on this portion of the brain. So if something is rostral to something else, it is going to be closer to the forehead. If something is caudal, it's going to be closer to the spinal cord. We do break the brain down into three major regions. So we have the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is going to be our most prominent and well-recognized region of the brain. It is divided into two halves. So when we look at a complete brain, most of what we're seeing is actually going to be the cerebrum. So cerebrum. It is a huge piece of the brain. It's almost 85% of the brain by volume. So it's not only very obvious, but it's also very large. We do divide it into two halves. So we can see that we divide it down this midline here. This midline is called the longitudinal fissure. We'll refer to that longitudinal fissure again later. Even though it's divided by this deep fissure, it is still connected. Right and left hemispheres are connected to each other by what's called the corpus callosum. It's this region right here, sort of looks like an ear on the inside of the brain. This view, this is a lateral view, would be as if this is a sagittal section, would be if we'd cut the brain in half down that longitudinal fissure, and then we're looking at the inside piece of it. Our second major region is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is also fairly notable. It sort of looks like, I always think it kind of looks like a walnut, like shoved up under the brain. It is part of the brain, so we don't want to make that mistake. It would be sort of situated in that posterior cranial fossa. So if you remember what the skull looked like, we had sort of a shallow, sort of the stair-step-like appearance, and this would be the frontal bone up here, and then this would be sort of the occipital bone. This cerebellum is going to sit in this posterior cranial fossa. So it sits sort of deep and low or inferior to much of the rest of the brain. It is separated from the cerebrum by the transverse fissure. So that's this big deep line right here. So we have longitudinal fissure, long ways, and then we have the transverse fissure, which is going to separate the cerebrum and the cerebellum from each other. It is about 10% of brain volume, so when we add the cerebrum and the cerebellum together, we're at almost 95% of the brain volume just between those two major regions. That just leaves us the brainstem. The brainstem is the rest of the brain, so it's easiest to see here. We have our midbrain, our pons, and the medulla oblongata. So it's this literal stem sort of structure that is situated almost interior to many of the other structures that we see here. In addition to our major regions, you'll notice that we have some really obvious markings, and so I've already mentioned a couple of those. We have our longitudinal fissure and we have our transverse fissure there. We also have what are called gyri and sulci, or gyrus and sulcus. These are going to be ridges and grooves. So these are ridges and these are grooves. Not groves, grooves. That's two O's and a V, not one O and a V. So, for example, this line right here, that would be a sulcus, and then this ridge that's associated with that is going to be a gyrus. Each of our brains has sort of a unique pattern of gyri and sulci. There are some that are consistent among people, so they are anatomically the same. Here's an example. The central sulcus is one, and then we also have the lateral sulcus over here. Those are consistent. We also have some gyri that are consistent, and so we will see those specifically when we go through the different regions of the brain and talk more specifically about the functions. But many of the gyri and the sulci in the brain are going to be unique to an individual. So this will be my last slide in this first little mini lecture. This is comparing white and gray matter. So from chapter 12's material, you should remember that there's a difference between white and gray matter. I know I mentioned it very quickly. White matter is going to be axons or neurons that are myelinated. I was going to write that, but I actually have it here. Oops. So our white matter is myelinated. That means that they are going to be sending impulses or signals from one to the other very quickly. Usually in the brain, what we're going to see is deep to the gray matter is where the white matter is located, and they form tracks. These tracks are ways that we connect. They're basically bundles of axons. Let me write that on here because we're going to come up with this term again. So these are bundles of axons that connect one region to another. And so when we look at this brain, we can actually see these lighter colored areas. Those are going to be our white matter. Those are going to be our myelinated axon tracks. So they connect place to place. Superficial to that white matter, we have our gray matter, and this is the term we use to refer to the brain a lot. We talk about gray matter all the time. This is unmyelinated, so the axons there are going to be sending messages a little bit more slowly from place to place. We don't need sort of the rapid transmission in these locations. We do have superficial gray matter, so it covers these outside. So when we look at the actual brain, that's what we see is sort of, it looks pinkish, but it's really gray matter. We also have nuclei, which are deep and oftentimes surrounded by white matter. So we'll again talk about those much more specifically as we get into the different functions and different organs or regions within the brain. Okay, so I am going to end here and talk to you again in a little bit.